Welcome everyone to the Department of Justice Budget Worksheet Completion webinar. My name is Christina and I will be your moderator for today. It is my pleasure to turn things over to our subject matter experts from the Department of Justice, Michael Williams and Suhaila Lasky.
Thank you, Christina. And again, welcome to the Department of Justice Fiscal Year 2019 CTAS Financial Management Budget Development Presentation. My goal, along with Suhaila, who will be co-presenting with me, is to try to give you some important information in reference to how to fill out a successful budget application and all of the components that are needed in your budget prior to submitting to the organization for a review and funding. So the deal is to get an idea of the planning process for your particular budget and look at those particular categories that you will be inputting information into in order to come up with a budget proposal to submit to the organization. To start off, based on the 2019 CTAS solicitation, based on the Justice website that you see above, you can go in there and look at the actual solicitation. You can also view a sample budget detail worksheet and narrative, and also the workbook instructions, which will be helpful during this process. Also, you'll find information in reference to the specific program offices that are providing funding through their solicitation, also allowable and unallowable costs, and something that's probably helpful is to view the frequently asked questions. So, in getting started, let's look at the various categories for a budget. We will be talking about specifically personnel category, the fringe benefits category, travel, the equipment category, supplies, subawards and contracts, the other category, and then finally the indirect cost category. So let's start with looking at personnel. In the personnel category is where you're going to identify all of the staff that will be working on this particular grant program. I want to say that it is important to at least identify the position. Sometimes when you enter a person's actual name in this application, if that person leaves, you may be required to submit again in order to change that. So when we're talking about positions, it's always best to identify the actual position. Now, this is different or does not hold true when we're talking about key personnel that needs to be identified on a grant application. So again, if we're talking about secretaries, grant coordinators, and things like that, you can identify the position, but the requirements for key personnel needs to be identified. So again, titles, whether we're talking about a director, sheriff, or whatever that particular title is, you want to reflect that. And then the percentage of time that these individuals will be working on a grant program. We normally like to see the compensation shown as an annual salary based on the percentage of time that the individual will be working on the grant program. Now, when I talk about percentage of time work on the grant program, be mindful that if you transfer an existing employee over to this particular grant program, be mindful of where they're coming from and whether or not you will be required to backfill any time from where you're transferring them from, because we don't want to run into a possible thing of supplanting. So be mindful when we transfer existing personnel and they're only going to be working a percentage of their time on this particular grant program. Also, be mindful to also include any type of increases or pay increases that an individual working on this particular grant program may be entitled to in upcoming years. So the most important thing that I want to say in reference to this is that whatever the cost is throughout the entire application, it must be necessary in order to fulfill the grant purposes, must be reasonable, okay? So make sure that anything that you're putting in there is reasonable. So when I talk about reasonable, is this a cost that a prudent person would also incur based on the same circumstances? must be allowable under the grant program and allocable or consistently treated within your organization. So there does not need to be cost treated different because we're implementing a federal grant program. It should be consistently treated within your organization. So now let's look at the actual worksheet. So based on the individuals or the names and the positions of the individual that's going to be working on the grant program, reflect that information. Again, remember I said that we're looking at the annual salary so that you'll see that the rate says yearly. So once you put in the percentage of time that an individual is going to be working on this particular grant program, the system will automatically calculate that. So you don't have to worry about calculating numbers in reference to the personnel or any budget category within the worksheet. Most importantly, I want to draw your attention to the budget narrative. It is important that you be as detailed as possible in the budget narrative. Here's why I say that. If I'm looking at costs on the worksheet and things don't appear to be reasonable, or I'm having problem understanding the amount associated with any budget category, it gives me the opportunity to look at the budget narrative, because maybe there's additional information in the budget narrative that will help me understand the numbers in the worksheet. If I'm not able to find the information that I need in the budget narrative, then my only alternative is to submit or send the application back to the program office and ask for more clarification. Right now, I would like Suhaila to come in and talk about this particular budget category from OVW's perspective. Suhaila?
Hi, thank you, Michael. Yes, so for our OVW grantees, I just wanted to make sure that I emphasize the importance of making sure that each of the staff people that are listed in this category have a corresponding narrative in the narrative section. So if, for however many people you have listed out with a breakdown of their costs, that they also have their narrative description that just describes the activities that they'll be performing for this award. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Now, let's move on to fringe benefits. Fringe benefits, what I normally need to see is what's all included in the fringe benefits package. So, for example, FICA, health insurance, retirement, I like to see that completely broken out. Normally, we are always talking about that it represents a percentage of salaries. So reflecting just the percentage is normally not beneficial to me. So I like to know what's all included in the fringe benefit package. So when you're listing fringe benefits, I'm looking for those actual amounts of fringe benefits. And in some cases, an organization may have a fringe benefits rate that they're charging back to the grant. Either way, I'm looking for all that's inclusive in the fringe benefits field. Be mindful of any unallowable fringe benefits, okay? Because not all fringe benefits can be charged back to the particular grant program. So when you're looking at fringe benefits, make sure that what's included are those fringe benefits that are allowable. Again, if we look at the worksheet, you can see here where various fringe benefits items are broken out, representing the base that it represents in here for their salaries. The specific rates, once that information is put in, again, the system will automatically calculate this information for you. And as you can see down the bottom, there's some information to explain important information in reference to the fringe benefits that are being charged back to the grant. Suhaila?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so I just wanted to go over for our OVW grantees real quickly. Whatever your policies are for your fringe benefits for your organization, you'll also apply those same policies for your staff. So if you have any confusion of, can I include this, can I include that, you just want to make sure that everything is consistently applied within your organization. However you would have applied it for non-federal funds, you'll apply it the same way with the federal funds. Thank you, Michael.
The travel category. Now, this travel category can be challenging to folks at various times. The most important thing to start off with is your agency's travel policy, okay? You should follow your own agency's travel policy, even though you're implementing a federal grant program. We will look at your travel policy and make sure that it's not more lenient than the federal guidelines, because if they are, then we will require you to follow the federal guidelines. But again, for the most part, we're looking for you to follow your own travel policies. So when we're doing travel based on the grant program, whether it's a required meeting or other types of travel associated with that grant program, you should be able to provide the computation for the number of travelers, how long they will be traveling. And I want to say one of the most important features is the purpose of that particular travel. How is it related to the grant program, or how will the purpose of this particular travel further the objectives of the grant program? Per diem, okay? Based on the per diem amount, and to give you an example, GSA updates the per diem website annually. Some organizations that use their own per diem guidelines within their travel policy, I've run into situations where they're not updated frequently. So again, if you're using your own policy in reference to per diem, I would say one of the good sources to update your per diem policy would be to look at the GSA website. Transportation. So whether we're talking about air, taxi, or using your own personal vehicle, any type of transportation that's required with this particular grant program, you want to make sure that all of that information is in there. Be mindful that there are other costs associated with transportation, for example, parking or tolls that need to be paid for. So again, make sure that you include all of these things in the travel. Just as an example, because in some cases it hasn't worked out to the benefit of the grantee, or they came up short. In some cases, when you're dealing with travel, the organization may not have identified where the specific location will be. So you'll see travels required, but the actual location is to be determined. So whenever you see things like that, I want you to be proactive. And say, for example, if you're on the West Coast and you're not sure where this travel is supposed to be, do your estimates for travel for somewhere on the East Coast. I want you to go as far out as possible, because if it ends up being mid part of the United States, this is a way of working in flexibility within your application. What you never want to do, and I've seen this happen before, an organization that was on the West Coast had to calculate travel for an upcoming event. They actually used the state that they were within, and then it ended up being on the other side of the United States. So they started off their particular grant program not having enough money in the travel category as a result of that. So again, looking at the worksheet again, all of the areas in reference to this travel should be identified in there. You can see the states where you're actually going. Whether we're talking about mileage, airfare, or lodging, there's space for that. The actual cost, based on the duration or the distance that we're talking about, once we put in the number of staff, again, this system will automatically calculate for you, so you don't have to worry about that. So what I will look at in your application is the detailed information or the narrative in reference to this travel, to make sure that the travel that is proposed in the application meets all of the requirements under that particular grant program. Suhaila?
So for this category, I just want to make sure that I mention for our OVW grantees that the travel category is for your staff travel only. You will not include costs such as your consultant or partner travel. You do not include, if you have a cost for client or survivor travel assistance, like if you have like bus vouchers, that is not included here. Also, if you are leasing or purchasing a vehicle, that is not included in this category either. So just, again, it's just for your staff travel costs and all the different examples that Michael listed out. And one other note If you see in the solicitation for the purpose area 5, there is a travel requirement of $30,000 for applicants within the continental U.S. and then Alaskan applicants, there's a requirement of $35,000. And the solicitation identifies 3 different types of travel that you need to include, different types of events. So just take a look at the solicitation and make sure that you're also compliant with the various travel requirements as well, because it'll list them out in the solicitation. Thank you, Michael.
Just to finish up on the travel category in reference to per diem, one note in reference to OJT funded contracts. If you will be hosting or putting on a training with OJT funds, one of the requirements that we have is that you get all of the participants the federal lodging rate, regardless of the number of attendees. So here's what I mean by that. Let's just say that you will be hosting a conference and the amount of attendees that are scheduled to be at this particular training is 35, okay? So you meet this threshold of getting all of the participants the federal rate for lodging. Now, this is even if there are only, let's say, 5 to 6 staff or participants that need lodging, because let's just say all of the other people are local and will be driving in each day for that. So this is regardless of the number of participants. The deal is if I'm having a conference and it's more than 30, I must get the federal per diem for lodging. And as you can see, it says that for conferences that are having less than 30 people, you are exempt from this requirement. The only thing that I would really add in this in reference to being good stewards of the federal dollars is that it doesn't hurt to reach out to the hotel and see whether or not you could possibly work out something, even though it's less than 30 and you're not required. Here's the GSA website in order to find out this information in reference to lodging and per diem. We also have this information in our DOJ financial guide. Next category, equipment. Based on the equipment category, again, you want to follow your agency's policy and procedures for equipment in reference to the capitalization threshold. If you have no policy, again, you must follow the federal guidelines in reference to equipment. When you're dealing with equipment, I have here unit and cost. I think it's always best to break out equipment in its lowest unit or component. What I mean by that, let's just say that the grant will allow you to buy a computer system for a staff's workstation. So instead of lumping the computer together, it's easier to break it out, for example, the mouse, the screen, the keyboard, break it out to its lowest component in reference to how you identify it. Again, the purpose of the equipment should be also a part of the application, saying how it will be used in the particular program. So what I want to do is say is that if based on the equipment, you must understand that the things that I'm getting ready to talk about now is in reference to the federal definition for equipment. So equipment, based on the federal guidelines, must have a useful life of more than 1 year and a fair market value of $5,000 or more. So again, I would say that your particular policy and procedures for equipment probably would be that it's for more than 1 year, but its fair market value probably would vary, could be less than $5,000. Again, if allowed to buy equipment with a federal grant program, you can use it for as long as you have a need for that particular equipment. When you no longer have a need for it to use for criminal justice purposes, there are a couple things that you want to keep in mind. It's fair market value. So if its fair market value is $5,000 or more, you must reach out to the federal awarding agency and ask for disposition requirements. In most cases, we'll probably tell you to sell the equipment and send the federal share back. There are other options where we may say if there is another federal program that can benefit from that equipment, then you would be allowed to transfer it to that other grant program. But again, if we say sell it, then you would send the federal share back. So let's just say that a grant program is a 75-25% matching requirement. So once you sell the equipment, then 75% of that would come back to the federal agency, and then you're allowed to keep the matching part, or the 25%. Again, information in reference to retaining equipment, you can find additional information in the 2 CFR point 313, section 5E. So again, if you don't have any more use for the equipment, reach out to the funding source in reference to how to handle that equipment. Suhaila?
So we wanted to just add a caveat for our OVW grantees. With the new regulations that came out back in 2015, for 2015 awards and on, there was a change that allows grantees to now identify, to classify their computing devices as long as the cost was less than your organization's capitalization threshold. As Michael mentioned before, the federal government's capitalization threshold is $5,000, and I specify that it would be to your capitalization threshold, because it might be lower than ours. So as long as it's less than your capitalization threshold, you can classify computing devices as supplies. Okay, so that was a change from before. They used to have to be classified as equipment items. Also, make sure that if you're including the cost for a vehicle, if it's a lease or if it's a purchase, it would be in the equipment category. If it's a lease, it would be in the consultants and contracts category. But if you have any sort of cost for the vehicle, you have to make sure that you also include a lease versus purchase analysis. And what that does is it includes a couple different quotes for both a lease and then also for a purchase for vehicles that are similar. And you'll just do an analysis that identifies the vehicle that you selected, the option that you selected, and that it demonstrates the most cost-effective measures as well. So if the lease is cheaper, then you go with the lease. And then you would also include all the different types of costs that are included with one or the other, like if there are, catastrophic costs or something that, if you have damage to it, then it would be X amount of dollars also, or if you have to pay per mile for whatever it is. If there's those little caveats that come along with leasing a vehicle, just include that as well in your analysis. Thank you, Michael.
So again, here is the worksheet reflecting how equipment should be presented on the budget. So again, identify the actual equipment, how many items that we're talking about, the actual cost, and once again, the system will automatically calculate this for you, so you don't have to worry about that. Narratives, always important. Again, if I have any questions about the items that are in any budget category, I will always resort to the narrative to see whether or not I can pick up additional clarification in order to determine whether or not this item is something that's allowable under a particular grant program. Next category, supplies. With supplies, the most important thing to keep in mind with that is that it may be easier in some time to lump supplies based on their particular categories. So in the first bullet, you'll see that it says office training and postage. So when I think of office supplies, I think of just about everything: pencils, paper clips, paper, everything. So instead of breaking all of that out, in most cases, you can lump it as office supplies. And then you can, again, remember, based on the narrative, you can give me a breakdown as to what's all included. That will help. So again, with training, postage, and I have postage here because in some cases, an organization will, in my viewpoint, have postage to be, let's say, in excess of $10,000. Without any additional information, I'm going to question that and or possibly send it back. But if I go to the narrative and say that and see that they are doing outreach to the community through newsletters, based on the amount of newsletters that they're sending out quarterly, monthly, or whatever the case is, Now that $10,000 of postage seems to be a lot more reasonable to me. So in any category, especially this one, when we're lumping items together like that, I may need some additional assistance or information from you in order to see whether or not these costs are necessary, reasonable, allowable, and allocable. Again, with the supplies, they should be in reference to project related. So how will they support the project? And then, like I said, in the budget narrative, if I'm having a problem understanding those particular items, it helps to look at the budget narratives. So again, based on the worksheet, we have listed out all of those items that we have identified as supplies, the actual amount or the number of those particular items, the cost. And again, remember, the system will automatically calculate this for you. And then again, like I said, if I have any concerns about any items in the supply category, I will default to the narrative category to see whether or not I can find additional information in reference to supplies. Suhaila?
So for our OVW grantees, I know that there are a couple different types of supplies. So like Michael was explaining that there's your general office supplies, but I know a lot of our grantees that you have different kinds of programs or projects within the grant that you work on. So you might have like healing circles, and in that case, you might have supplies for those activities. So I would recommend that those are not lumped with the regular general office supplies. Like general office supplies are your pen and paper, toner, paper clips, those kinds of things. But then you have other types of things, like I said, like if you have the healing circle, you might need some supplies for that. Or if you, one of your other activities, if you do like crafts and have costs for beads or leather or different types of fabrics, then those will be different types of supplies. So you want to just separate those out. So it would be, your program supplies versus your general office supplies, which is also separate from your maybe healing circle supplies or your sweat lodge supplies. In also the narrative, then you'll give a description for each of those different types of supplies and break down the cost and justify them as well. Just, describe what the purpose is and what activities are occurring. So you might have a couple different supplies as an OVW applicant. So just keep that in mind as well when you're creating your budget. Thank you.
Next category, construction category. I'll start off by saying that generally construction is not allowed under most DOJ grant programs. There is one or two in the Office of Justice programs, but things have changed, and I'll get to that in a minute. So if we're not talking about construction, which in most cases is hard to do now with Department of Justice grants, there may be renovation involved with a particular building that you need to utilize for the grant program. So all of the things that will bring this building up to code, drywall, repairs, painting, plumbing, whatever the case is, that is now considered renovation, because now we're trying to take a building and either bring it back up to specs or have it at least fit the program that we're working on. So again, based on all of the items that are included, the unit cost of everything should be identified in that particular application or in this section. The purpose, again, describe the renovation of the work that needs to be done. So again, I said there are a few programs in the Office of Justice programs that allow or did allow construction. So, and that was purpose area number 4. So now new construction is not allowed for purpose area number 4. But again, based on renovation or updating a building, that is now allowed. They also say that they will allow prefabricated facilities to be used under their grant program under purpose area number 4. So again, based on the worksheet, all of the information in reference to this renovation or this work that needs to be done should be identified again based on the items that I need to do, its actual cost. The system again will calculate this for me, so I don't have to worry about the calculation process. But again, based on this particular section, I am going to gather the bulk of my understanding about everything that needs to be done in the narrative section. So make sure that you are as complete as possible or detailed as possible, so that gives the analyst the sufficient information that they need in order to make a decision about this specific budget category. Suhaila?
Thanks. So as Michael identified the purpose area 4 that allows the different types of renovation costs, I just wanted to clarify additionally that OVW purpose area 5 does not allow any renovation costs. So just make sure that there aren't any types of costs included, like even something as minor as, painting walls or changing locks on doors. Those costs are not allowed. You can't read carpet or anything. So just keep that in mind for your OVW grants. You can have a locksmith come in and rekey a current lock, but they cannot change the lock. I mean, it's like a little bit of a silly caveat, but it does make a big difference as far as what's allowable and what's not allowable. So just keep that in mind when you're creating your budgets as well. And if you have any questions, you can always contact our help desk too. Thank you, Michael.
Subawards and procurement. This section includes both, so you're really going to have to be mindful to make sure that you're placing the subaward or the procurement item in the proper category. So when we're talking about subawards, we're talking about passing money down to another entity that's going to perform an aspect of that particular grant. They're going to carry out what's in the solicitation and or help you achieve the goals and objectives of that particular grant program. On the other side, when we're talking about procurement, in most cases, we're talking about hiring out for goods and or services. Again, most problems with this particular category is they isolate the terms in goods and services and say that someone that is providing service, because it appears to be a procurement nature, they are misclassifying a subaward as a procurement. Give you an example of what I mean. Let's just say that your grant program requires you to provide some type of mentoring service to a targeted group of folks. You don't possess that particular type of expertise within your organization, so you will contract that service out. So even though it's a service, it's still an aspect or component of that grant program. So it's not a procurement nature, it's actually a subrecipient relationship, because they will be implementing an aspect of that particular grant program. Also in here, when we're dealing with consultant rates, when we're hiring for various types of services, be mindful of the DOJ threshold, which is currently set at $650 per day. Sole source justification means that I put a solicitation out on the street, and based on the specs that is in that proposal, I only receive one response to that, creating a sole source. The other way is that I go specifically to a particular organization and hire service with them, creating the sole source. So we are not saying that you cannot, again, based on whether we're talking about a subaward and or procurement, we will identify that information on the worksheet in this section. And again, based on the total cost or other information that we put in there, the system will automatically calculate those numbers for me. And then again, any questions that I may have looking at either subrecipient agreement and or a procurement relationship, if I'm not 100% sure that I understand all that's in that budget category, I am going to heavily rely on the budget narrative to hopefully extract that additional information in order to approve this section of the application. Suhaila?
Thanks. So I just wanted to expand for a minute for our OVW grantees on subawards versus contracts. It's like a really gray area because a lot of times it can be confusing. Do I classify this as a contract and do I classify this as a subaward? But it's so important to make sure that you are making an appropriate distinction between the two and that you are issuing the right type of agreement. And the reason why is because each of either a subaward or a contract, they carry different requirements. So you'll have to follow the procurement process or procedures for a contract, but for a subaward, you don't follow those procurement procedures and you follow different regulations within the CFR. But I do want to advise for our OVW grantees that we just created a webinar for budgets, and I go into it in really detailed manner about how to determine a subaward versus a contract. And it's actually on our OVW website under the applicant resources page. And I'll talk with our hosts afterwards and provide a link for that. So if you have any requests to view that webinar, and if you just want a quick link for that, we can be able to provide that for you. But it is something that needs to be addressed regularly because it does come up in audit findings, and we just want to make sure that we are providing the right type of assistance for you on the front end so that you don't have any issues or questions about it later. So I'll be able to provide that link for that webinar for you if you need that after the presentation. Thank you, Michael.
The other category. Based on all of the categories that we've went through, in some cases, items in your particular application does not fit in the components that we just talked about. So there's always the other category. Even though it's in the other category, I still need to know specifically what those items are that are listed in the other category. Again, the major types, so whether we're talking about phones or utilities or other things, they need to be listed under the other category. A breakdown of its cost needs to be also reflected in there. Here's what I hope that I never see in an application, even though I'm saying the other category, is that we list something and call it miscellaneous, okay? Because whatever is miscellaneous, if we look at that particular category, you can identify what is in that miscellaneous or what you're considering miscellaneous based on that dollar amount. So the key is to, again, break down every item or types of items in the other category and provide the breakdown for that so we can assess it to make sure that it is something that's necessary, reasonable, and allowable under that particular grant program. So looking at the worksheet here, again, all of the descriptions for those other items need to be clearly identified on the worksheet. Its total cost, and again, the system will automatically calculate these numbers for you, and the narrative. Again, if I'm having issues understanding any items in the other category, I can always refer to the narrative that you provided with the application to try to get a clear understanding of those items that I may be experiencing problems understanding. Suhaila?
So for our OVW grantees, this is the category where you'll include different types of costs like client emergency assistance, travel assistance for your survivors, and other types of costs that maybe weren't best suited for the other categories. But there will be a lot of costs that you'll probably find if you have like a phone cost for a cell phone for your staff, for your advocates, or anybody else on the grant. And then you just want to make sure that those costs that are shared are prorated as well. Thank you, Michael.
The next category, the indirect cost category. An organization may be able to charge indirect costs back against the grant program. So if you have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate or an approved indirect cost rate from your cognizant federal agency, you want to make sure that you submit that with your application. It needs to be current, okay, in order to charge costs against that particular grant program. The uniform guidance now allows something called the de minimis rate, or to be able to charge an indirect cost rate without going through the negotiation process of up to 10%, okay? So it's based on the modified total direct cost. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are certain items in the total cost of a proposal that would need to be excluded or taken out in order to charge these items against a particular grant program. Why it's called the modified total direct cost. If you're dealing with an approved indirect cost rate, there are a few versions or types that we use here at DOJ. Provisional rate. Provisional rate in most cases is the rate that you're currently using, and it at a specific point in time, it will be closed out and become a final rate. You'll do the renegotiation process, and then once that is approved, it now becomes the provisional rate moving forward. So there's a predetermined rate and in some cases a fixed rate. So again, you have an option to either use an approved indirect cost rate or the 10% de minimis rate. If you're using the de minimis rate, the key to use the de minimis rate is that a recipient must have never had an approved indirect cost rate in the past. So I say never and stress this because if I've had an approved indirect cost rate in the past and it expired and it has been expired for 10, 15 years, I cannot use the de minimis rate because I must have never had an approved indirect cost rate. Again, I can charge up to 10%. I can use the de minimis rate indefinitely or for as long as I want, or until I decide that I want to negotiate because the 10% de minimis rate isn't actually covering all of my anticipated costs that I'm having with this particular grant program. The most important thing to remember when you're charging indirect, so whether it's de minimis or an approved indirect cost rate, my cost or your cost under this particular grant program must be consistent, okay? Any cost that I identify as indirect can't be charged someplace else directly, okay? So it has to be consistent on all of my awards with the agency. So based on the worksheet, I am, or you will be identifying the description of the type of indirect cost that you'll be utilizing, the base for it. Again, remember I said there's a modified total direct or other types of negotiated rates, that actual percentage, and then as you can see, the system will automatically calculate that for you based on that percentage. And then again, narrative. There should be some information in reference to the proposal that you have from whatever the cognizant federal agency is, the agency that provides you with the most federal dollars, or that you elected to use the de minimis rate. Suhaila?
Thank you, Michael. I think you covered everything for this category. Just another reminder, make sure, please, that you include the agreement with the application package and that it is current, the current rates. Thank you.
So here we are at the summary. So based on us going through all of the budget categories, then based on that, on each purpose area that we're applying funding for, we should now be able to go back and check or verify our totals in reference to each grant program that or purpose area that we are applying for. So here are some reasons that we note that an application may not go through the entire process on its first go round. And that is that the application was submitted without thoroughly complying with all of the instructions in the solicitation. So if there was a requirement to do X, Y, and Z, it probably wasn't done. Unallowable costs have been included within the worksheet. The narrative contained content is missing or inconsistent with the breakdown of the worksheet. And again, if we're talking about indirect cost rate, the rate was not submitted, could be expired, or if they elected to use the de minimis rate, that information was not also included in the application. Suhaila, do you have any additional items that you note on why a budget won't clear?
I think you hit the points, Michael.
Okay, great. So with that, this concludes our presentation in reference to the budget worksheet. We will now turn it over for questions that you may have in reference to this entire process. Christina?
Great. Thank you, Michael and Suhaila. The first question is, should we put staff that will help direct the overall project, but they're not paid by the grant? Would that director who supervises the CTAS coordinator, the coordinator whose salary being requested, should that director be listed somewhere?
If they're not being reimbursed through the grant for OVW grantees, at least, I would say that they wouldn't be included in the budget because it might be confused with being shown in a way that would be match. And if match isn't required for your program, then you definitely don't want to include it in the grant because then you'd be required to report on it, and then it would have to follow the same regulations as the federal funds. So I would say that if they're not being funded through the grant, then don't include them in the budget. You can include it in if you have any other like project narratives, like any other type of narratives that are separate from the budget. That would, I'm guessing, would be a great place to include that because your program specialist would probably want to know, you know, who else is supporting this project that is relevant. Just I wouldn't include them in the budget though.
And OJP does agree with that because adding this individual that's not being paid from the grant probably could create more confusion than anything else.
Great, thank you. And for purpose area 5, the announcement tells us a set amount to budget for travel. When we do the computation based on the federal per diem rate, they do not add up to the purpose area 5 set amount. Can we just put in one cost item for the $35,000 required and not break out the calculation for the 3 required meetings?
I will get additional clarification on that. I am not sure if in 2019 if that can be allowable, but I would also caveat it with that if you would just use like a sample, like estimated amounts. I mean, that you should be able to come up to somewhere close. But I will find out if for this solicitation, if you can or cannot include just like a lump amount. And the only reason why I'm not sure, 100% sure on the answer is because when I looked through the solicitation before the call, it did specify 3 different types of events that you need to attend. Let me grab that real quick. And so I'm not sure if they want you to break it out specifically. So I'll double check with the program side to see, like, do you have to have a new grantee orientation, the annual tribal summit, and a biannual sex trafficking conference. So my guess is that they'd want you to break it out, but that's only because they included 3 specific type of conferences that you need to identify in the budget. But I'll find out. I'll get more clarification on that. And Christina, I'll touch base with you after the call and provide you with that response if you want to give that out for OVW applicants.
Perfect. Thank you, Suhaila. And another question is on the budget narrative. We're not able to add spacing. Hitting the enter bar doesn't take you to the next line. It makes the budget narrative look bulky, long and bulky, and harder to read. I noticed in your budget narrative examples, there is spacing. How can I fix this to make our budget narratives more readable?
Here's what I want. This is OJP. Here's what I want to say in reference to that, because I thought that there was adequate space allowed in the narrative. If you're having problems with that, it's always best to contact GMS Help Desk, and they can walk you through any issues that you're having with spacing for the application.
Great, thank you. And can you please confirm if on the East Coast, should I use DC for any TBD travel for rates?
I gave that example just as East Coast. So I'm not saying that you can't use DC, but again, I just want you to be mindful that if you are on the West Coast and the program office said that they're still working on the venue in reference for that training, but they want you to set money aside, I just don't want you to come up short by not being, I use the term proactive. If I'm on the West Coast, the possibility of me going to the East Coast is probably very likely as opposed to me staying in the actual state. So whether you use DC, New York, Florida, make sure that you are estimating this travel on the other side of the United States.
Can I interject real quick, not about this topic, about the previous question that somebody had about the actual form itself, the Excel spreadsheet. What I did was, it was a question about like it being bulky and you can't hit enter to get to the next line. I don't know if it's going to be too much work, but a little bit of a workaround that I just kind of figured out was that I went into Word and I typed it out. I typed it with enters, I typed it with bullet points. You know, I had all the different types of formatting that I might have that I would regularly like to appear on a narrative, and I just copied it from Word and then pasted it into the narrative box, and it pasted just fine for me. So I don't know if that's a workaround option for anybody. If it's too much work, forget about it. Don't worry about my recommendation. But if it's something that you might find helpful, then please go ahead and try that.
Great, thank you. And what is the indirect rate allowed for capital purchases?
When we're talking about indirect costs, especially when we're talking about the modified total direct costs, capital purchases must be removed from the base. So there can be no indirect costs associated with capital expenditures.
Right, but I would also advise that the grantee refers to the base that's identified in their indirect cost rate agreement, because your base might be salaries and fringe, or your modified total direct costs if when you negotiated the rate with your cognizant agency and those costs were not excluded, or they might have been excluded. So I would definitely refer to what it specifies in your indirect cost rate agreement as costs that are supposed to be included or excluded.
Great, thank you. And for the next question, there's a question and then there's two examples that follow the question. The question is, for a tribal youth program under Purpose Area 9, how do we break down supplies like program materials? This is highly dependent on lessons and programs of the month, needs of our youth, and we explain the monthly need, $250 a month, and it is based on historical spending. But it seems that we need to break down to the exact, and the exact supplies we anticipate needing across the life of the grant. Another example is estimating printing costs. We estimate printing needs based off of historical needs, but this changes each month depending upon what is occurring in the program. Is an estimate sufficient, or do we need to further justify our estimate?
Let me say that Purpose Area number 9, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquent Prevention, that person was not able to be on the phone line today, but we'll make sure that that specific program office gets these questions and either get it back to you or get it to be posted on the webpage.
Great, thank you. And is the travel requirement of $30,000 for each purpose area, and is the $30,000 for each 12-month project period or for the entire project period?
I'll respond for OVW grantees. The $30,000 that I referenced for the required travel amount, that is specifically for OVW Purpose Area 5. I cannot speak to the other purpose areas. I haven't reviewed the solicitations for the other purpose areas. So definitely just check the purpose area that you're applying for. But what I had mentioned previously was just for the OVW applicants in Purpose Area 5. It is for the entire period of performance. So it is not for each 12-month period. So if it's a 36-month application or project that you're applying for, then it is $30,000 over the period of 36 months, or $35,000 if you're in Alaska, just because the costs are more expensive to come to the other 48 states.
And under the construction category for the budget, we are allowed to apply for renovation costs for purpose areas 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, correct?
Since, let me say this, in reference to the presentation that I gave, I'm only aware of Purpose Area number 4, or the Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA. So I could not, because I'm from the financial component of OJP, I cannot answer the question for the rest of those purpose areas.
No, for Purpose Area 5, I can speak specifically for. Costs of renovation are not allowable. and that includes minor types of renovations, such as like changing a carpet or painting the walls or changing a lock. You would be able to rekey a lock, but not change the actual physical lock itself. Or that's for like lighting. You can't install lighting. You can change a light bulb, obviously, but you can't like install lights. Also security cameras. If it's anything more than really just like hanging a picture on a wall kind of installation of something, then you couldn't do that. You couldn't include that either. Like a lot of times we might recommend there's another option is like a safety button, something that it does not get put into the wall. So if like basically if you're like going into the wall, if you're rewiring anything, installing wires into it, then those are not allowable. And generally when we review the budget, again, this is for purpose area 5. So when we review the budget, if we see that there is a cost that looks like it might be considered something like, renovation, then we'll ask a few different questions to follow up just to make sure, because we don't want you to have to return any funds at any point later on down the road. So if you get some questions, then just provide the responses as, like what kind of installation are we talking about?
And let me add this in reference to purpose area number 3, BJA. Now, I'm sure that renovation is offered under purpose area number 4. So it may not be allowed under purpose area 3. So I would reach out to BJA specifically in reference to purpose area 3. So my presentation dealt with purpose area number 4, which I do know that they allow it under that purpose area. Purpose areas 6 and 7, the Office on Violence Against Crime, OVC. Now, currently they are looking at their language in their solicitation, and they should be able to identify to you what type of renovations that they're considering or allowing under their particular grant program. So again, there was a question with the OVC grants in reference to whether certain costs that were considered renovation should be allowed under their grant program. So I know that they're working with legal counsel now in order to determine what cost or what items will fall under renovations for their grant programs.
Great, thank you. And as it relates for purpose area 5, if we are applying for transitional living, are we allowed to apply for and purchase mobile trailer homes?
The purchase, I would say, I would have to get back to you on that. So I would say probably to rent the mobile homes, I think would be okay. But it would there are other types of things that would be included in like the purchase of something like that, like whether or not it's like a capital, like a capital asset that you're purchasing, or if there is any installation, because they'll have to bring if they have to like bring the actual mobile homes, and then they have to install different, like maybe like a sewer line, or if they have to install like the platforms that it goes on. So I would say that would depend on the other types of costs that are included, but I would definitely say it would be a much more allowable situation to rent a mobile home, or if you have like if something already exists, to rent that, or if it is owned by another person, then then if you lease it from them. So I think that I would have a lot more follow-up questions regarding this one. So if Christina, whoever sent that question, if you can put them in contact with OVW GFMD, I do have a couple additional follow-up questions before I'm able to provide an actual response for that.
Okay, great, thank you. And then for a vehicle purchase for law enforcement under purpose area 1, does one need to have a compare the lease cost versus a purchase cost?
For purpose area number 1, which is the COPS program office, they were also unable to join on this particular session. So maybe we can take that information and get that over to COPS so that they can answer that question as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And how many days or nights should I use for mandatory travel? How long are each of the training sessions?
I think it would be fair to estimate maybe 3 days of 2 to 3 days of training and 2 travel days. And that's just honestly, that's just an estimate. I don't want to make anybody nervous and think that every single travel event's going to, reflect like a full week's worth of their time. I mean, there's travel that's all over the country, something that might be close to you, something that might be a little bit farther away. You might be in a remote area, or you might be like in a highly populated area. So, I mean, I think like a fair guess would be maybe 2 days worth of training, 2 days of travel, or maybe 3 days worth of training, 2 days of travel, something to that effect. We totally understand that it's not set in stone.
Great, thank you. And lease versus purchase analysis, is this a requirement? We are proposing for COPS Purpose Area 1, we want to purchase a couple of SUVs for our canine bomb dogs. The purchase may be more than lease, but it is part of our sustainability in the past grant duration. We would prefer to purchase the vehicle. Also, would we have to sell the vehicle after the grant is over? Most vehicles will last more than 3 years.
I think that this would be another one that Michael said that you guys will follow up with the COPS office on that, because I think that they'll be able to provide the guidance on that response.
Yes, I agree.
Great, thank you. And how does the current indirect rate need to be? For example, we had a 2018 rate, but our 2019 rate is being negotiated with DOI.
For OVW grantees, I would recommend that you submit your application with the rate that you have at that time. Your budget may be reviewed prior to it being awarded, or it may be reviewed after it's awarded. So if it's reviewed at a point where the rate that you submit is current, then they'll review that. They'll review the budget with that rate. If at the time the budget is reviewed and the rate is not current, then they'll contact you to request the current rate. So I just submit your application with the rate that is current at that time.
And I agree with that from OJP.
Okay, thank you. And are incentives for participants allowed?
I have a couple other questions, I think, related to that, but I would say as like what type of scenario is the person referring to? But I would say in general, incentives are not allowed for OVW grants. Now, if you have somebody that is attending a group meeting or like a healing circle, and they need funds for transportation, then you can include that in your budget, that you're giving them bus fare or taxi fare, or if they need have daycare costs that need to be covered while they attend, and you provide them with some reimbursement for their daycare, or if, so those kinds of costs, if you're helping a client to attend an activity that is relevant to the project, then you can generally reimburse them for costs that they incur as a result of their participation, but they cannot be provided with incentives. But I may not be answering this person's specific question just because I need a little bit more information. So if the person who's asking this is an OVW applicant for Purpose Area 5, please feel free to follow up with our help desk, and Christina has our email address that she can provide to you, and you can get some more clarification, and we can ask a couple more questions. Thank you.
And then I'll just add in reference for OJP. When we're talking about incentives, I agree with Suhaila. For the most part, OJP program officers don't look at that as being allowable cost, but I would say that you would reach out to those specific program officers. And like Suhaila said, that if there's something that you're providing and you can justify how and why, that's something that the program office can look at to make that type of determination, because that is more of a programmatic call as opposed to a financial call. But for the most part, for OJP, I agree. That's something that's generally not allowed under OJP grant programs.
Great, thank you. And there was just a comment that someone said regarding the Excel spreadsheet, if you press Alt-Enter, it will return down a line as another way to make that less bulky. And also there is another question, and that is, aren't computing devices considered supplies just across the board and just not for OVW grant applications?
For OJP, I would say yes, because that's how it is identified in the uniform guidance, correct.
Great, thank you. And in the CTAS solicitation, every time it mentions the required CTAS orientation, but it never mentions the number of days that orientation will be. We need to plan for a number of days of hotel stays and per diem, but we are unsure of how many days we should plan on.
I would refer to the last description that I provided about just estimating either 2 travel, 3 actual conference days, or 2 and 2 travel, 2 conference days. I think that would be fair because it is an estimate, so it's always subject to change.
And then from OJP, I would agree. So whether you use the dates that Suhaila gave you or you use more than that, again, it's just an estimate. So hopefully the individual program office will look at those estimates and be able to provide more detail by the time they're reviewing the application. But again, I agree, it's just an estimate. So we realize that, especially when we're talking about to be determined or having provided you with that information, I believe that each program office will look at that to be just an estimate.
Great, thank you. If we included costs in our budgets that are not approved, does DOJ correct that, or is it sent back for correction on the application?
For OVW grantee or OVW applicants, we are in contact with the person who's listed on the application as the point of contact, and we will advise any requests for changes that we have, and at that point the applicant then sends us back via email a revised budget that reflects the changes that we discuss. So it comes back to us from the applicant with the changes in that same type of Excel document that you submit with the application.
And that's the same format for OJP as well.
Great, thank you. And for lab kits, is that considered a supplies category, or should that be looked at as a procurement? In the past, we've used it as supplies.
Is this for one of your programs, Michael? I don't recognize those types of costs for Purpose Area 5.
I'm not 100% sure, but I want to say that if it is a lab kit, check with the specific program office. If it's listed as a supply and they really want it to be reclassified someplace else, like we just said, then they would reach out to the grantee, tell them that that needed to be moved to another category, and then you would just resubmit the application with those changes.
Great, thank you. And for the indirect cost rate, is that locked in for the full 3 years of the grant, or are we able to modify the budget to account for an increase or decrease in the indirect cost rate?
I think we might have a different answer, Michael, so I'll go for OVW. You will apply the rate that is applicable to the period that is in your rate agreement. And so, yes, it may go up or down based off of, what is approved for that period that's in the actual agreement document. For OVW grantees, we do not require you to submit a budget modification GAN through GMS when you have changes with your indirect cost rate agreement and your indirect costs. You do need to submit a budget modification GAN for other changes, but not specifically if your indirect cost rate changes. And that is a difference from your awards made in 2014 and prior. So your awards from 2015 and on, those do not require, that change is not a requirement for you to submit a budget modification GAN. There are other changes, like I said, that will trigger that requirement. But we also do advise that any changes that occur, even if they do not require a budget modification GAN submission, that you do reflect the changes internally in the budget that you maintain on file within your organization, so that like, let's say if you eventually have changes that hit that 10% threshold of cumulative changes of the budget, then you know that you will be reflecting those changes as well that occurred with that indirect cost rate changes.
And from the OJP perspective, we're looking at the range of the dates that negotiated agreement it's allowed for. So if it's a 12-month or a 24-month period, that's the period that rate is applicable for. Different from OVW, that if the rate changed, let's just say, for example, your indirect cost rate is 15%, based on the new negotiation that you receive, it increased to 20%. In order to utilize the 20%, you must do a grant adjustment or a GAN in the system, also including the new proposal showing that you want to use the higher rate. The same thing would happen is if the rate went down, in order to use the lower rate, a GAN would have to be submitted in order to reflect those changes on our end. So again, you're looking at the proposal. What are the dates on the proposal? How long is it good for? Those are, and based on the award period, that's the time frame that you can use or charge that particular rate. In the event that it changed, OJP will require you to submit a GAN to us to get that new rate approved to be used from that date forward.
Great, thank you. Michael or Suhaila, do you have any additional comments at this time to share?
One other reminder for our OVW applicants, that there is a requirement for applicants to submit responses to a list of 10 risk assessment questions, and it's found on that CTAS forms webpage. So I just wanted to remind our applicants that it's there. There are 10 questions. Last year, I think that there were only 8 listed there, but it will really help speed up the whole application process for when we review your application, if you can make sure that you include it with your submission. So please just take just keep that in the back of your head when you're submitting all the information for your application. That would be super.
And from the OJP perspective, I want to say that the questions that you're asking now are very good. That's the only thing that I really want to reiterate and make sure that you grab hold of. In the event that you have issues with the application process, or after you start implementing your grant program, I want you to know that we're always here to assist and answer questions for you. So please don't be shy. If you need additional assistance, please reach out to us, because we would prefer that you reach out in advance so that we can address any issues that you may have, as opposed to later on that question that you had end up being an audit finding and money is slated to come back to the federal agency. So again, we're here to assist you. So please, during the application phase or while you're implementing the grant program, if you have questions, please pick up the phone and or email us so that we can help you.
Great, thank you both. And we would like to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you can join us for future fiscal year 2019 CTAS webinars. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a great day.